The bench was cold before I sat down on it, and it was colder by the time the meeting ended. I remember that detail more than almost anything else from that morning because I have spent so many years since then trying to understand how a room full of people I had known my whole life could grow so quiet so fast over 11 words. I was 19 years old. I had been baptized only 4 months before, kneeling in that same room with water touched to my head and a promise made that I did not yet understand the weight of. And on that particular Sunday, in the middle of a members' meeting, when the floor was opened the way it always was opened, for anyone with a concern to speak it, I raised my hand and I asked why the ban on the Hochstetler family had never been explained to the rest of us. That was all. I did not accuse anyone. I did not raise my voice. I asked one question, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, it had weight. It pressed down on my chest the way water presses on your ears when you go under too fast. And I understood, before anyone said a single word back to me, that I had done something that could not be undone. My name is Hannah. This is the channel where I tell the stories the outside world was never allowed to hear, one at a time, the way I lived them. If you are new here, I grew up Old Order Amish in Holmes County, Ohio, in a district so small that everyone's grandmother had once been someone else's aunt. I was baptized at 19. I was shunned before I turned 20. And I left for good 5 years after that when I was 24 years old with one bag and a phone number written on the inside of my wrist in pen because I did not trust myself to remember it if my hands were shaking, which they were. If any part of what I'm about to tell you sounds familiar to you, if you have ever asked one honest question in a room that decided your honesty was the problem, I want you to stay with me. Please subscribe and hit like because it helps more than you know for these stories to reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments, have you ever asked a question that everyone around you had privately wondered too, but no one else was willing to say out loud? I read every single one of your comments. Everyone. To understand why one question could carry so much weight, you have to understand what a members' meeting is and what it is not. In the outside world, a question is just a question. Someone does not know something, so they ask and someone else answers, and the room moves on. In my community, a members' meeting was not a place where questions moved a room forward. It was a place where the Ordnung was maintained, the unwritten code that governs everything from the width of a hat brim to the number of pleats in an apron to whether a man may own a car with an engine louder than a certain number of decibels. No one has ever seen the Ordnung written down in full, and yet everyone can recite the parts that apply to them without hesitation, because it does not live on paper. It lives in the air of a district the way weather lives in the sky. You breathe it in from the time you are old enough to notice that your mother pins her dress differently than the English women at the grocery store. And by the time you are grown, it is inside you, the way marrow is inside bone. The hierarchy of that world was equally unwritten and equally absolute. God above all, then the bishop, who spoke for God in matters of the district, then the ministers and deacons beneath him, then the husband within his own household, then the wife, then the children, each layer accountable to the one above it, and each layer expected to yield without complaint. There is a word for that yielding, Gelassenheit, and it does not translate cleanly into English, though the closest anyone ever got for me was surrender. Not surrender in a single dramatic moment, but surrender as a daily practice, a posture you held your whole life the way you hold your shoulders when you are cold. Pride, by contrast, was called Hochmut, and it was the sin most often assigned to women who asked questions, women who wanted explanations, women who noticed that the rules seemed to bend more easily around the men who made them. Ephesians was read at every wedding. Wives, submit to your husbands. Nobody ever finished the verse out loud. The part about mutual submission, the part about husbands loving their wives as their own bodies. We only ever got the first half. A wife submits, a husband leads. That was the whole sentence. Spoken so many times it stopped sounding like an instruction and started sounding like a fact of nature, the way you might say, water is wet. Everyone in the district knew what had happened with the Hochstetler family, or knew enough to know that something serious had happened, but no one had ever said the words out loud in front of the whole congregation. In the outside world, when something goes wrong inside a community, there is often a conversation, sometimes a difficult one, but a conversation. In my community, there was often only silence, and the silence itself was the message. Everyone knows, no one says. It does not have an official name in our language, this particular kind of collective quiet, but it exists the way many things in Amish life exist, unspoken, understood, and utterly binding. I need to tell you a little about how I got to that bench before I tell you what happened after I stood up from it. I was married by then to a man named Daniel, and we had met the way most young people in our district met at a Sunday evening singing when I was 17. He did not say much to me that first night. He helped me hitch my horse afterward in the dark, and he said my name once quietly, the way you might test whether a word fits in your mouth. We were married the November I turned 18 on a Tuesday, the way weddings were always held on a Tuesday or a Thursday, never a weekend, because weekends belong to the regular rhythm of farm life, and a wedding was permitted to interrupt it only on the days set aside for interruption. There were nearly 300 guests. The preaching lasted almost 4 hours before the vows were even spoken. We ate roast chicken and creamed celery, and there were 7 kinds of pie laid out on tables that ran the length of my parents' machine shed, which had been swept and decorated for the occasion the way it was every wedding season, turning something built for tractors into something briefly beautiful. Daniel was not a cruel man. I want to say that clearly, and I will say it again later because it matters. He was quiet, and he worked from before light until after dark, and he had been raised inside the very same silence that had raised me, so that when the moment came for him to choose between what he privately believed and what the district expected him to do, he did not really have the tools to choose differently than his father would have chosen, or his father's father before him. We had our first child within the year, a little girl we named after my grandmother, and for a while, in that first winter of marriage, with a baby's breathing filling the dark of our bedroom and the wood stove ticking as it cooled, I believed that the life laid out for me was simply the life I would live, the way you believe a road will keep going in the direction it is already going. I was baptized that spring, along with 6 other young people my age, in a ceremony that felt less like a beginning and more like a door quietly closing behind me, though I did not understand yet what it meant to be on the far side of that door. Baptism in our church was not a private matter between a person and God. It was a formal joining of the person to the congregation, an oath of obedience to the ordnung and to the discipline of the church for the rest of one's life. And it was the single event that made everything after it possible: marriage, full membership, and also, though no one ever phrased it this way, to a 19-year-old kneeling on a bench with water running down the part in her hair. It was the event that made a formal ban possible, too. You cannot be excommunicated from a church you never joined. Baptism was the moment I became someone the church had the authority to lose. Here's the inciting incident, the small thing, the thing that would sound trivial to anyone who did not grow up inside that particular kind of silence. I asked why the Hochstetler family, a husband, a wife, and 4 children who had abruptly stopped coming to church the previous autumn, had been put under the ban, and why none of us had ever been told the reason. I did not ask out of defiance. I asked because their oldest daughter had been my friend since we were both small enough to share a single lap at church, and I had watched her disappear from every gathering for months. And I had watched my own mother change the subject 3 separate times when I brought up her name, and something in me, some small, stubborn, ordinary human thing, wanted to know why a girl I loved had simply vanished from my life without explanation. The rule is that the trigger has to seem small from the outside, and I promise you, to anyone standing outside our world, it was small. A girl asking why her friend disappeared. That is all it was. What happened next did not happen all at once, and that, I have come to understand, is the design of it. The response was never a single loud event. It was a ladder, each rung colder than the last, and I climbed down it one small step at a time without ever being pushed. The first rung was Daniel's silence. He did not scold me on the ride home from church that day. He did not say anything at all. He unhitched the horse and he fed the animals, and he came inside and ate the supper I'd made without once looking up from his plate. And that silence lasted 3 days, and then 4. And I began to understand that silence in our house was not the absence of a conversation. It was the conversation. The second rung was my mother, who came by on the fifth day with a jar of canned peaches she did not need to deliver in person, and who sat at my kitchen table turning her coffee cup in small circles on the wood and said, without looking at me, that a wife who lets the cold in cannot complain when the house freezes. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count. I still do not know if she meant it as a warning to protect me or a warning to protect herself from what people might say about the daughter she had raised. Perhaps it was both. Her hands never stopped moving the whole time she said it. The way the hands of Amish women rarely stop moving even when they are delivering the hardest news they will ever deliver to you. The third rung was my husband's sister, who dropped by 2 days after that with a plate of snickerdoodles and a great deal of coded talk over coffee about how some questions were better left to the men who understood the situation fully and how it reflected on Daniel, being married to a wife who spoke up in a members' meeting the way I had. The fourth rung was the bishop's wife, arriving unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon while I was hanging wash, standing at the edge of my yard in her black bonnet with an expression that was not unkind, exactly, but was not warm either, asking after the baby, asking after Daniel, never once mentioning the question I'd asked, and somehow making it clearer than any direct accusation could have that everyone already knew why she had come. The fifth rung came at a quilting bee 2 weeks later, when an older woman named Lydia sat down beside me at the frame without a word and began threading a needle with hands that had done the same motion 10,000 times before. She did not look at me while she spoke. She never looked at me while she spoke. Not that day, and not any of the handful of times over the following years when she would say something to me that mattered. She said, while pulling the thread taut, that they do not hit us, that is not our way. What they do is harder. She said it so quietly that I nearly missed it beneath the sound of the other women's conversation at the far end of the frame, and then she went back to her stitching as if she had said nothing at all, and I understood even then that she had just handed me something no one else in that room would ever hand me directly. The truth, delivered sideways, the way Amish women have always learned things, quietly, without eye contact, so that if it was ever repeated, she could say she had never said it plainly. The sixth rung was the bishop himself, who came to our house on a Saturday morning in a room my mother had made too warm on purpose, with coffee poured and a pie already sitting on the windowsill, and who told me, in a voice that never once rose above a gentle murmur, that we do not want to lose you, Hannah, that the church only wants what is best for its members, that a question asked in the wrong spirit, in front of the wrong people at the wrong time, could unsettle a district that had worked so hard to remain at peace. He never raised his voice. I want you to understand that. He never once used a harsh word. He simply sat there, tall and gray bearded and endlessly patient, describing the path back to peace so gently that it took me nearly an hour to realize he had also just described, in the very same gentle words, the path toward being put out of the church entirely if I did not walk back the way he wanted. Before I keep going, if this is resonating with you at all, I want to pause and thank you for staying with me this far. These stories are not easy for me to tell, and I know they are not always easy to sit with either. If you have not already, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you do not miss the rest of this one and the ones still to come. The seventh rung, the final one, came at a council meeting the following month. And this is the part of the story that I still find myself least able to describe without my hands going cold, even now, even years later, even in a warm room with a cup of tea beside me. I was asked to kneel in front of the congregation and confess that I had spoken out of a proud spirit, that I had questioned matters that were not mine to question, that I had caused unrest within the body of the church. I want to be honest with you. I did kneel. I confessed. I said the words they needed to hear because I had a daughter at home and a husband beside me whose family had lived in that district for 5 generations, and because the alternative at that point felt less like a choice and more like a cliff. But something in me, kneeling there on the wooden floor with my knees already aching, understood for the first time, with a clarity I had never had before, that the friend I had originally asked about, the girl I had grown up sharing a lap with at church, had likely knelt on that very same floor herself, confessing to whatever unnamed thing had put her family under the ban in the first place, and that no one, not one single person in that room, would ever tell either of us plainly what we were actually being punished for. We were being punished for being punishable. The reason was almost beside the point. I want to be careful here because I do not want you to walk away from this video thinking I am telling you that everyone in that room was cruel, or that the bishop was a villain in a story, or that my husband was somehow less of a man for staying silent. My husband was not a monster. He was a man raised inside the same silence I was raised inside, taught from the time he could walk that a household running quiet was a household running correctly, and that the worst thing a man could do was let his wife's voice become louder than the district's comfort with it. The system is the thing, not the people. I do not hate the Amish. I do not hate the community that raised me. That community also gave me things I still carry with gratitude: a work ethic that has served me every single day since I left, a faith in something larger than myself that I've had to rebuild in a different shape but never had to abandon entirely, and a handful of women, my sisters among them, whose hands taught mine how to bake bread and can tomatoes and hold a crying baby at 3 in the morning without once complaining. I do not tell you this story to burn down everything that made me. I tell it to you because both things were true at once. The community that gave me bread also gave me silence, and I am still, all these years later, learning how to separate the two. The months that followed the council meeting were the coldest of my life, and I do not mean the weather, though that winter was cold too. The kind of cold that turns the water in the horse trough to ice by morning and pushes frost feathers across the inside of the windows before the stove has been going even an hour. I mean, the particular coldness that comes from being watched by people who love you and who have decided, for reasons that were never fully explained even to them, that loving you correctly now requires a certain distance. I was not formally shunned yet. That came a year later, after a second incident I will tell you about in a different video because it belongs to its own telling. But the groundwork had been laid, the way frost lays the groundwork for a freeze. People at church greeted me a half second later than they used to. Conversations that once included me began to happen just outside my hearing. My own mother, who loved me, who I know loved me, because I watched her hand shake when she said goodbye to me on the day I finally left 5 years later, began speaking to me in the careful, measured way you speak to someone you are worried might break something if handled wrong. The climax of this particular chapter of my life did not arrive with shouting. It arrived the way most of the important moments in my life arrived, quietly, while I was doing something ordinary. I was standing at my kitchen window one morning in early spring, watching the last of the snow retreat from the garden rows and patches, gray and shrinking, revealing the black dirt underneath a little more each day. And I found myself thinking about my friend's family again, about the Hochstettlers, about the 4 children who had simply stopped existing in our shared world without a single word of explanation ever offered to the rest of us. And I understood, standing there with a dish towel still in my hand, that I had spent an entire winter learning a lesson the district had worked very hard to teach me, that the question itself had never really been the problem. The problem was that I had asked it out loud in a room where other people might have started wondering the same thing. The silence was not an accident. The silence was load bearing. It was holding something up, and I had put my hand against a wall I did not know was structural, and I had felt for one single moment how much weight it was actually carrying. I will not tell you the story of my full leaving today, because it belongs to a different video, and because it happened later, after the second incident, after the formal ban, after 5 more years of a slow, cold winter that never entirely thawed. What I will tell you is that when I finally did leave, it was with one bag, a ride arranged quietly through a Mennonite woman in town who had helped other girls before me, and a little money I had saved, a few dollars folded into the lining of a sewing basket over the course of nearly 2 years, hidden the way Amish women have always hidden the small private evidence of their own planning. The aftermath of a ban, even an informal one, does not look like anger from the outside. It looks like letters returned unopened. It looks like phone calls that ring and ring into a silence that has a particular texture to it. A silence you learn to recognize the way you learn to recognize a stranger's footstep from a family member's. It looks like your own father, a man who once let you ride on his lap while he drove the hay wagon, learning to look through you at a market in town as though you were made of glass. Because looking at you directly, acknowledging you, would have meant something he was no longer permitted to mean. It looks like sisters crossing to the other side of a street in town, Not out of hatred, I have come to believe, but out of a fear so total it had reorganized their instincts without their permission. I did not have language for any of this when it was happening to me. I only had the feeling of it, the cold coming in, the cold not fully going back out, even in summer. It was years later, in a small beige office with plants along the windowsill and a therapist who kept losing her reading glasses in the folds of her own cardigan, that I first heard the words that finally matched the shape of what I'd lived. She was English, small, and endlessly patient. And she was the first person who ever explained to me, plainly, without coding it sideways the way Lydia had, what had actually happened to me. She called it coercive control. She told me that consent given because the cost of refusing has been made unbearable is not really consent at all. It is compliance wearing consent's clothing. She told me that emotional withdrawal, used consistently enough, becomes its own form of punishment, every bit as effective as a raised hand, and in some ways harder to name because no one can point to a bruise. She said something to me once that I have never forgotten. Sitting in that small office with the light coming in sideways through the blinds, the most effective systems of control are the ones that feel exactly like love. And she said something else, a little later, that I have carried with me every day since. A community that cannot hold your questions does not actually trust its own answers. I think about that second sentence more than almost anything else from those early years of therapy. Because that is really what happened to me at 19 years old on that cold bench. I did not attack anyone. I did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. I asked a single honest question about a friend I loved, and the response to that question told me more about the fragility of the answer than any actual answer ever could have. If the truth about the Hochstetler family had been something the district could bear having said out loud, someone would have simply said it. The fact that an entire community organized itself quietly and without a single raised voice around the task of making sure that question was never asked again told me everything I needed to know about how little confidence they actually had in their own explanation. If you have stayed with me this long, I want to say something directly to you now because I know some of you watching this are not thinking about barns or bonnets or bishops at all. You are thinking about your own room, your own family, your own quiet system of consequences for the people who asked too many questions. If you grew up in a place where your honest curiosity was treated as a betrayal, I see you. If you ever felt the temperature of a room change the moment you said something true and understood without anyone explaining it to you that you had just done something that could not be undone, I see you. If you were ever told that loyalty meant silence and that love meant never asking the question that was sitting right there in front of everyone, plain as a friend who had simply disappeared, I see you. You were not disloyal. You were not proud. You were not too much. You were a person who noticed something true and said it out loud in a room that had built its entire peace on the agreement that no one ever would. That is not a flaw in you. That was and is a kind of courage, even when it did not feel like courage at the time, even when it felt like nothing more than a girl asking about her friend. Tell me in the comments what part of this story stayed with you the most. Tell me your story too if you are ready to. I read every single one of them, every time, and I know how much it costs some of you to write them. If this is the first video of mine you have watched, please subscribe to this channel because there is so much more I have not yet said about the second incident, about the ban that followed it, about the day I finally left with one bag and a phone number written in pen on the inside of my wrist. Until next time, choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life. Your question was always a whole sentence. It always was.